Guys, let's try something a little bit different for tomorrow. So on questions 10, 11, 12, and 13 of the review, all I want you to do is try setting up the proportions. You don't have to solve. I'd like you to still solve for question number 9, and you can solve for question number 14 at the bottom. That's fine. But for 10, 11, 12, and 13, I just want you to practice writing the proportions. So let me show you a trick or a hint that you might be able to use to help you write the proportions, because notice for each question there are going to be 2 proportions. So on number 10, you're going to have to write a proportion to find x, and then you're going to have to write another proportion to find y. So maybe something that would be helpful here would be to separate the 2 triangles, because really what's in this diagram, there is a smaller triangle in the diagram that is similar to the larger triangle in the diagram. So maybe it will be easier to match the corresponding sides if we draw them separately. So here's the smaller triangle in the diagram. Let me draw it separately. So its left side, if you will, is 12. Its right side is 8, if you will, and the bottom is 14. And I know that that small triangle is similar to the large triangle because of these parallel segments. Those give me corresponding angles that are going to be congruent. So I know the angle at H is going to be congruent to this angle at C. I know the angle here at J, it's going to be congruent to the angle at D. So I can mark that. So here is the triangle CBD. CBD. And I've got my angle at C and my angle at D with 2 arcs. And now I'm going to draw the big triangle. So the big triangle is HBA. So here's the triangle HBA. And now I'm going to label the sides of this triangle. I suppose I should label the angles first. So notice H has 1 arc. So just like the angle at H and the angle BCD, those are corresponding angles that are congruent. I can see that by looking at the small triangle and the large triangle here because I have my 1 arc, so I know those are congruent angles. Same thing, the angle J and the angle BDC, those are congruent, and I can see that. Here's the angle BDC, and it should be congruent to the angle J right here. So in the big triangle, the bottom, if you will, is X. Now here's the interesting part. The right side of this triangle is not the 8, it's not the 10, it's the sum of those. The right side is 18. That's for the big triangle. Same thing for the left side of the big triangle. The left side of the big triangle is not the 12. It's not the y. It's the combination of the 12 and the y together. That is y plus 12. Just like on the right side, we added the 10 and the 8 to get the 18. On the left side, we need to add the y and the 12 to get that full length, y plus 12. So from H to B, that's y plus 12. I'm going to label it here. So now I can try writing my proportions, and you can solve them if you want to, but all I want you to try is writing the proportions. So let's start with X. So X is the bottom of the big triangle. So I have to match that to the small triangle. The bottom of the small triangle, if you will, is the 14. The real reason why they correspond is because those sides are both between the angles that are marked with 1 and 2 arcs, but it's okay. The way we've positioned them, I can think of those as the, quote, bottoms of the triangles. So the X and the 14 are corresponding signs. Now notice, I don't want to match up the right sides. There's a problem. I know that the left sides. I know the left side of the little triangle is the 12, but the left side of the big triangle also has a variable in it. I need to find the scale factor. I need to match up sides where I have numbers for both of them. That's going to be the right sides. So notice the right sides are the 8 and the 18. But you have to be consistent when you write your proportion. So x is in my numerator, that came from the big triangle. The 14 is in the denominator, it comes from the smaller triangle. So to write my next ratio, I again have to start in the bigger triangle, and I'm going to use the 18 because that's a specific number I can use to make my scale factor. And that 18 is between the angle with 2 arcs and the angle I haven't marked yet. So here is the angle with 2 arcs and the angle that I haven't marked yet. That 18 then has to correspond to this 8 in the smaller triangle. So that's the proportion for x. So now the proportion for y, notice the side that has y in it is the, if you will, the left side of the big triangle. So I'm going to start with that. Y plus 12 is the left side of the big triangle. The left side of the smaller triangle is just the 12. So those sides have to match. Now notice, I need to come back to the big triangle, and I need to pick a side from the big triangle that I can use to make my scale factor. Don't pick the x. I don't know that yet. Pick the 18. So I know from the big triangle, the 18 has to match the 8 in the smaller triangle, just like it did in the first proportion, that 18 to the 8. If you reduce that, that's your scale factor. So the trick that I'm suggesting is that you take the figure and you rewrite it so that you can see the small triangle and you can see the big triangle separately. And then I think it will be easier to match up the parts. Just try writing the proportions. We can worry about the solving later. Writing the proportions tells me if you understand the corresponding sides. That's the more important skill here. So in question number 11, it's a little bit easier to match up the corresponding sides because you already have 2 separate triangles. Notice the vertical angles are the same, so I could mark those. And of course, once the vertical angles are the same and the right angles are the same, that also means that the third pair of angles will be the same. So you can use the angle markings in those triangles to help you set up your ratios, to make your proportions. So here, let me start each one of them. So if I want to find x, x comes from this triangle on the left. It corresponds to the length between the 1 arc angle and the right angle. So here's the 1 arc angle and the right angle in the triangle on the right. That's a 4. So the x and the 4 have to correspond. So x came from the triangle on the left, so I need to stick there. I don't want to use the y. I don't know what y is yet, but I can use the 6. That 6 is a specific number I can use to make my scale factor. So that 6 is between the right angle and the angle with 2 arcs. In the triangle on the right, here's the right angle and the angle with 2 arcs. That corresponds to a 3. So you try then finding the proportion for y. So y comes from the triangle on the left, and it corresponds to the side that's between the angle marked with 1 arc and 2 arcs. See if you can finish that. So the same strategy that worked on 10, that will work on question number 12. So you've got the corresponding angles that are congruent because of the parallel sides. So now I'm going to draw the smaller triangle here. I'll draw it out here. And I'm going to label the angles and the sides so that maybe it's easier to find them. So the 6, if you will, now it's sort of on the left side of the triangle. The y is on the right side of the triangle. And the 8, just informally, I'll kind of call that the top side of the triangle, if you will. So that's the small triangle. Now I'm going to write the big triangle. And I'm going to label all those sides. So here's the big triangle. So in my big triangle, here are my congruent angles in the big triangle. So in the big triangle, the top side, if you will, we'll call that the x. Now, this side on the right, it's not the 11 by itself. It's not the y by itself. It is the combination. It's the sum of those. It's y plus 11. That's what's on the right side. The left side is a little bit easier. The left side of the big triangle is not the 12. It's not the 6. It's the 12 plus the 6. That's 18. So your job then is to find proportions that you can use in order to solve for x and to solve for y. So here's my suggestion. Start with a proportion for x. X comes from the big triangle. It's between the angles that are marked with 1 and 2 arcs. So you want to match that to something in the smaller triangle that's between the angles marked with 1 and 2 arcs. So then when you come back to the big triangle then, you want to make sure you use a number. I wouldn't use the right side, I'd use the left side. You have to use a number so you can set up a scale factor. So the difference, if you're solving for y, I'll tell you what I would do here. I would start with the small triangle. Y is by itself in the small triangle. So, and that's between the angle that's marked with 2 arcs and with no arc here. I haven't marked that angle yet. So that y from the small triangle is going to correspond, if you will, to the right side of the big triangle here. You can write your ratios that way. And then now here the y came from the smaller triangle, so when you write your second ratio, you have to go back to the smaller triangle. Make sure you are using a side that has a number which will correspond to another number in the big triangle so that you can make a scale factor. So again, try finishing those proportions. The nice part about number 13 is you're only solving for x, so you only have to write one proportion here. Try that on your own, see if you can do that. So I hope that this strategy of separating the figure into 2 triangles and labeling those triangles carefully with the angles and the sides, I hope that helps you see in an easier way how to write your proportions.